Welcome to the Mr. Beacon podcast. We're back to the healthcare market and we're talking to another interesting company, Vizzia, Andreas Stavropoulos, who is Director of Product at Vizzia Technologies. They are a healthcare architect of solutions, systems integration company, solutions provider. Healthcare's been at the vanguard of IoT and real-time location systems from the earliest days. And there's a lot of companies making a lot of money selling into this, but it's still a market that is wide open. Andreas caught my attention. He contacted me as a listener to the show, but dropped into the conversation that he runs a lab where they evaluate different technologies. And so that got me going. We had this conversation. We don't just talk about the technology. We talk a lot about the business aspects, the impact, solution design and product, what the use cases are, who's buying, but also we go through a discussion of the different technologies that are out there. And so I think you'll find that useful and interesting, even if you are not focused on healthcare. So stay with us for that. Also wanted to use this part of the show to thank the folks at AIM. So AIM is the Professional Association for Auto ID, and they work on standards for identification, barcodes, ambient IoT, RFID. And I was really honored that they have given this podcast the Bert Moore Excellence in Journalism Award. And Bert Moore is an early writer and evangelist in the auto ID industry, did some amazing work. So to have anything that's named after him is really awesome. And I am tremendously grateful to the folks at AIM for giving us this. This is, really for me, it's a hobby. It's an excuse to stay current, and it's a way of continuing the life of the Beacon Technologies, the book that I wrote years ago. But now it's turned into a way of engaging with some really cool people and just having some great conversations. So to get an award like this is humbling and really, really gratifying. So thank you, AIM. So let's move on and listen to the conversation with Andreas. I think you'll really enjoy it. Well, Andreas, welcome to the Mr. Beacon podcast. I am really excited to have you on because A, you're a solution provider, so you have to solve all sorts of problems. B, you are focused on healthcare, which is a very important area in this whole IoT space. It's one of the most fruitful areas for solution designers and entrepreneurs to focus on. So I think we can learn from you. And 3, you're kind of doing a bit of what I've done, which is to kick the tires, test lots of different systems. So I am keen to pick your brains and hear a bit about what you've found. But let's start off where we normally start off, where you explain a little bit about Vizzia and what you guys do.
Great. Well, thank you so much for having me. It's a real honor to be here. Vizzia is a company that has been in the healthcare space for almost 20 years. And it's a company that has always focused on questions around providing value to customers through transparency. Mm-hmm. And the origins of that were in equipment transparency, kind of the straight asset tracking and then eventually asset management use case. That has evolved over time as different technologies have become more competent, more capable, and also users have become more sophisticated over time. But essentially, Vizzia is a company that we work with many different OEMs, but we don't build at the hardware layer. We don't do engineering at the hardware layer. We do engineering at the software layer, and then we are present at the sites of all of our customers for the many stages of designing, deploying, maintaining a solution. Because one of the things that became evident early on was that an engineering solution alone, even an excellent one, was not going to fulfill the promise of return on investment. And it was not, so there needed to be kind of an integration specialist, and there needed to be some level of, I don't know if I would call it exactly white glove service, but essentially sort of carrying forward and ensuring that the promise of the solution was actually delivered on. And that has, we've seen a lot of technology change over time. And so some of it is a lot easier to deploy, to design, to maintain, to do change management on. But the facts that there is kind of a human component required to educate, to train, to check in, to expand use cases as the customer needs, that hasn't changed. And we've been focused on that for a long time. And it's been a successful strategy in which, as the technology changes, we can evaluate, what the best fit for the customer is. Because we want to be in a position where years after signing a contract, the customer is saying to us, I'm so glad that we went with the solution that you recommended. And the flexibility in solution stack allows us to kind of match the best technology with our hardware, which was explicitly designed, with our software, which was explicitly designed to be hardware agnostic and to be able to ingest information from different OEMs and hardware solutions. We want to be in a future state, and we have kind of completed this full circle with many of our customers where they say, thank you for recommending this software to me. I now want to do something else that I didn't even know about, but you did. And so now we actually have a platform that we can do that on. So that's kind of a short version of Vizzia and kind of how it sort of uniquely fits in and has kind of uniquely designed a solution stack with kind of a flexible hardware layer.
Great. So you're architecting these solutions, and I think you'll have learned a lot of things on the way. And I want to get into what are some of the use cases that you've focused on, and the lessons that you've learned, and your view on the different technologies. Before we go there, just let's complete painting the rough picture of your firm. Tell me a bit about your customer base, the kind of size, kind of customers that you have.
Yeah, our customer base is mostly comprised of medium to large hospitals, predominantly in the Southeast and Southern California. That said, we do have significant presence of field ops there. So that allows us to be very present and kind of to fulfill the promise that we make when we begin a contract with the customer. So that said, we are kind of constantly expanding on those geographies. And there have been instances where customers who are not in that immediate geography, we do find a good way to kind of maximize the value that we can give to them.
And how big is the firm?
Oh, gosh. I think it's approximately 50 people, kind of across the board.
Very good. So you have quite a lot of capacity there to bring pieces together. And who do you find yourself competing against when you're looking to close new business? What sort of companies is it? I mean, I tend to get very focused on the OEMs, the original equipment manufacturers, the people that are making the technology. So are you finding yourself competing with a Stanley Black & Decker, someone who's got their own solution and an ecosystem around them, or do you just consider them as a potential supplier to a project that you'd be designing?
Yeah, that's a great question. So depending on the OEM, they may offer a full stack solution. So let's say I'm the OEM, my hardware, my software, my crew deploying it. But there's also a lot of OEMs out there who recognize that there are limitations, and they need to focus their expertise really on the hardware and providing that. So oftentimes we will collaborate with those OEMs who are they're really looking for a best-in-class software solution to go with their hardware, and that includes OEMs that may even have their own software, but recognize that there are kind of some unique capabilities of ours because we've been specifically making software for 15 years, and that's a significant lead time when you're talking about answering the specific questions that users in hospital are looking to have answered. So to back up for a second, we have gone up against probably most OEMs who are in this space. And we have also been in many situations where a hospital has been dissatisfied with a solution that they've implemented. It could be because there are technical limitations and, maybe the reality of owning a hardware solution don't quite match up with the promise. And so that is a situation that is fairly common for us too, where we are looked to essentially remediate a hospital from a failed implementation, or perhaps an implementation that was not a complete failure, but degraded with time due to some level of neglect and had become more of I won't say liability, but it wasn't providing value in according to kind of the original promise. So I think that Vizzia has a reputation also for being looked to remediate situations from some other providers.
I used to work at this great company called Sequent Computer Systems, and amazing culture, pioneering technology. And one of the other aspects of the company, which was really cool, was the CEO, who's a fantastic storyteller and salesperson. He used to be general manager of Intel's microprocessor products division. And from him, I learned the value of storytelling and metaphors. And the metaphor he loved to use was second surgeon, which seems to be kind of very apt for what you're describing. And the story is you find out who's really good after you've kind of rushed in and you've had your knee surgery with basically the first doctor you could find that was available. And suddenly you realize that actually this is more complicated than you think, and you're experiencing pain. And then you really look around and ask around and find who is the best in this business, because my second surgeon needs to really be able to fix the pain that I'm in. So it sounds like you're sometimes a second surgeon. Who I mean, I'm not super experienced in the healthcare space other than being a consumer of it. So who are the big OEMs that you run across in this marketplace?
Yeah, I mean the ones that you mentioned, Stanley, Sonator, Centrec. Let's see who else. Contact.io.
Yes.
Potentially HID. So there's a lot of folks. I think that it's not difficult to describe the value that is possible in the healthcare environment, right? Things are expensive, they disappear, it's extremely complex. So the narrative to create and the spreadsheets to create are quite simple. And the pitch that you can make to a CFO is quite simple. And the pitch that you can make to the director of clinical engineering, it also resonates. But it is really the longevity and kind of capability of the solution that's going to determine how valuable it is to the customer. And there's an inherent asymmetry in a hospital looking for a real-time location solution. And the asymmetry is very simple. It's that this is a decision that they will make once, twice, given the tenure of and availability of RTLS, you're not talking about someone who's making a decision and sort of staying fresh on research and information. And so the asymmetry there is that they have very imperfect information, whereas we are tracking all of these developments, and we're actually bringing in each of these technologies that we think will be promising, again, to address the specific challenges of healthcare, which are different. They're different than warehousing. They're different than, fabrication. And because we've been around for a long time, we know where all the bear traps are and what to look for. So essentially, we are sort of a professional buyer of hardware, and we don't make those decisions lightly. We very, very carefully consider different technologies and kind of square that against needs that the customer has explained. But also, we do take a little bit of liberty to know that the customer may actually have future needs that they're not able to articulate because they don't know about them. Or they're just not along that, they're not on that path for sort of RTLS adoption or kind of organizational sophistication to be able to use cases or things like that. So we're looking out for our customers and trying to source the best hardware for them. And that's based on lab testing. There's very, very few places that you can actually do side-by-side comparisons of RTLS, let alone have 5, 6, 7, 8 systems operating simultaneously. And in the lab, we construct simulated clinical environments that create some of the, sort of the bear traps that I mentioned earlier, where we know that the technology sometimes falls flat and sometimes doesn't deliver. It could be related to the presence of glass. It could be related to, the presence of a lot of metal, like around the headboard of a bed, the positioning of equipment in a room. There's a long list of things that a hospital, when they're considering a solution, unless they've done this, unless their CIO or whoever the contact person is, whoever the champion of the project is, unless they've gone through this multiple times recently, they're not going to have the sort of fresh information. So I think that's where we provide a lot of value.
It's a great point. How is that clinical hospital environment different to a manufacturing environment or a retail environment from your solution design architecture perspective?
Sure. Well, it can, not always, but it can start with the architecture. So, in a hospital, we're typically dealing with a lot of rooms that are in close proximity to each other, drop ceilings, concrete slab floors, metal stud walls, some combination of glass wall and not. That's evolving. More recently constructed hospitals have more glass, the typically so you're getting into really like a condensed environment where your room size is very small, but you still need to know, in an ideal case scenario, you really want to know, is it in the room or is it in the next room?
Yes.
Like, that's a very, very important distinction, depending on the use case. I'm not going to say that is the only acceptable threshold of location quality, but once you start to move up from sort of the simple use cases to the more complex ones, you don't want to be sending out a staff duress alert, which is, a call for security to come help. And unfortunately, that's becoming much more common. But you don't want to send out a staff duress alert from the wrong room, which could also be in the wrong wing of a hospital.
Yeah, I remember being told that infrared technology got a real place in healthcare because of that. Light doesn't go through walls, radio waves do, and obviously you can solve the radio waves bleeding problem in a variety of ways. But are you seeing infrared still being a predominant solution, or is it giving way to other things?
Both, I would say. Both are true. I think that, there's a spectrum of use cases which demand performance in a couple of dimensions. One of the dimensions is latency. The other dimension is accuracy. So you've got those. And then you have the other consideration of form factors and availability of tags, which there's a lot of specific requirements in healthcare. When clinicians are trying to track something as small as a small telemetry box, up to a, larger medical equipment. So when you overlay like a lot of those requirements, and you try and kind of consider use cases that may not be front of mind right now, but are increasingly front of mind for customers, like I mentioned, like a staff duress use case, or an infant wandering, or patient workflow, or hand hygiene compliance. It then just becomes a question of what type of solution are we going to create and recommend that will satisfy that will basically take that customer as long as they want to go on the arc of use cases. And there are, infrared is what I call kind of a bounded signal, right? Like I said, there is some complexity when you get into more glass. Ultrasound is a bounded signal, and then RF, as you mentioned, can bleed and get into interference and things like that. That said, there are significant advances in RF and Bluetooth that is making it behave more similarly to something bounded. But there are still trade-offs in that you might be trading a high level of, let's call it room level accuracy. You might be trading that for increased latency, because in order to develop the quality of that location, the processing time that's required to run the algorithms is greater than just like a binary read from an ultrasound, from an infrared. I'm in the room, I'm not in the room.
So I don't quite understand can you go into that latency thing a bit more? Are you talking about cloud analytics that are kind of smoothing out the signal strength fluctuations? Is that the
right?
latency?
I mean, what I'm talking about is some of the more successful Bluetooth systems that we've tested are I call them successful because they do have pretty good accuracy, kind of room level accuracy. But the reason that they have the room level accuracy is because the tags are collecting information over a specified amount of time, and then they're sending those packets up to the cloud to be resolved into a location, and just the time required to kind of collect location information, sending into the cloud, processing it, and resolving that into a geofenced area on a map. That is where we see latency kind of accumulate over those various stages.
I can't get this duress use case out of my mind. Why do you think the incidence is going up?
Oh, I think that's a much larger conversation
Right.
related to kind of violence in our society than we will probably have time to get into. But I think suffice to say that there was just a New York Times article, I think about a week ago, talking about emergency departments, acts of violence, and kind of the increasing need for that use case, for staff to be able to send a discrete communication saying, I need help. And again, unfortunately, that use case is also present in a much broader swath, like schools is another area. We are not in that vertical. We're not providing solutions to that environment, and it's very sad, but it is a reality.
Yeah, I have a friend that works at PricewaterhouseCoopers, PwC, and they've deployed RTLS systems in most of the hotels in the Las Vegas Strip. And their system uses a low power wide area network technology, and that's exactly the use case. It's the all of the cleaners and the hotel staff who are frequently getting threatened or assaulted, and it's kind of very sad. So let's move on from that use case, and I am interested in just going through some of the key use cases. You've touched on them already, but where do you think the ROI is? Where are the trends going? Is there anything has there been an epiphany? I mean, it seems like improving the patient experience, helping them find their way through this labyrinth, automating the check-in. It seemed like COVID was a driver for automating the check-in, but I sort of see a lot of half-baked attempts to do this, and people with systems in place that aren't really used half of the time. So what are you, let's spend a bit of time on the use cases and who the winners are and the losers are in the use case race, where the value is, where the difficulty is.
Sure. So when I think about use cases, I think I mentioned this previously, I kind of structure them in my mind along a spectrum of performance requirements from the RTLS with those two dimensions of location accuracy and latency. And roughly the progression that I think of use cases in medical RTLS are, kind of asset tracking. We're starting obviously with the lowest level requirements and moving to maybe wayfinding, patient tracking, staff tracking, patient workflow, hand hygiene compliance, staff duress, elopement. That's kind of the spectrum that I might of use cases that I might kind of put along that line. And we're in a situation where the ROI and the case for RTLS with regards to asset tracking is becoming very well understood. Even though the majority of hospitals don't have RTLS, I would say that the vast majority of hospitals and people in decision-making positions in those hospitals have knowledge of RTLS. And probably, based on the number of studies out there, probably believe that it could indeed provide value to their organization over time, and if it's done well. That said, some of the, I'll call it like the up and coming use cases are patient workflow and staff duress and hand hygiene compliance. I'll talk about hand hygiene compliance a little bit because that's kind of come on fairly strong lately. Mm-hmm. And I do think was, although not a lot of movement happened during COVID, I would say that a lot of awareness was created during COVID of hospital-acquired infections and the role that technology can play in reducing those. So hand hygiene compliance is quite demanding, right? Because you have to know, when did a caretaker enter a room or a zone or a geofence boundary, whatever we want to call it. When did they enter that? And when did a hand hygiene event occur? And how are we defining that? Are we defining it because we have a piece of hardware that says when soap was dispensed? Are we defining it because we have a high level of location accuracy and a very low latency, so a very responsive system, and we could actually create like a small geofenced area around the sink? So there's questions about how to define it. And the reason that a lot of folks are trying to solve this as quickly as possible is because, number one, it's related to patient care and the quality of care and readmittance. And that, of course, is also linked to how hospitals are compensated for their services. They, if a hospital-acquired infection occurs and the patient needs to stay in the hospital, there is some portion of that the hospital needs to essentially foot the bill for. And so there's a strong level of impetus, is there a way that we can use this technology, but simultaneously make it as invisible as possible? And once we use it to figure out what's going on, how do we then percolate those findings into, adjusting and training the behavior of the people that are doing that frontline work? So that's become very significant lately, along with staff duress, I would say.
I was speaking to someone, I think it was at a Cooper conference in Finland, and they had been using angle of arrival. It was actually a US solution provider based in Florida, and their system, I believe, would have some kind of visual indicator that the doctors wore that showed if they were on top of their hand washing or not. And the idea was that the patient's family would say, doctor, why is that red light flashing on your lapel there? And the green light isn't on. And then the doctor would be so embarrassed that they basically had been caught not washing their hands, because that was basically the indicator, that compliance went way, way up, because the thing that doctors fear the most is losing that feeling of superiority, losing face in front of nurses and patients and patients' families. I'm not it now seems so far-fetched. I can't believe that it actually worked that way. But how do you tell people that they need to wash their hands if they haven't?
Well, first things first, we need to collect the baseline data to kind of understand what the level of compliance is. And then we need to have those tricky discussions with the customer, like what level of surfacing and transparency do you want in this data? The example that you just mentioned is dramatic. I mean, it's like someone showed up in a room and they're wearing, a big A on their shirt or something. Right. So, that's obviously a very dramatic example. And that organization, I'm sure, had to think carefully about how we want to present this and how we want to do change management within our ranks. So I think that we don't consider it to be our place to prescribe how an organization changes. We really see our role as providing the best information to the level of granularity that is desired, which can be individuals. It can be, well, Steve, you are not washing your hands, my friend, or the same thing of me. But, getting it that last mile. And that kind of goes back to the communication piece that I keep talking about, like really making implementing it. We have suggestions, we have ideas, we have things that we've seen be successful, but ultimately the customer or kind of the manager of that program needs to decide what's going to work for their organization, or try something, and then if that doesn't work, try something else.
So just to reiterate, most hospitals are still not doing any of this. Is that a fair question to say? Or fair statement?
I mean, the numbers are changing rapidly, right? So, if I'm looking at the number of hospitals that have an RTLS, I might be only able to get data from 2022 or 2021. And, but yes, I believe we're still under 50%, penetration of RTLS in mid to large size hospitals. And that's not even talking about the different use cases. That's talking about like the most basic use case of asset tracking. And so, that does create some opportunities and questions around, some hospitals, they need a solution now, and they may be able to afford, this solution, and it might be a viable solution for their most pressing pain point, which is asset tracking, shrinkage of the fleet, utilization, things like that. And so part of the process of really working with the customer is to understand how forward thinking they are. Are they kind of fixated on the known, tried and true ROI in asset tracking, or are they also kind of thinking of the spectrum of future uses that we know from talking to hospitals all across the country is coming? It's coming fast, and it's linked to real dollars for the hospitals, many of which are struggling. So, that's again sort of that role that we can play as a strategic advisor. We don't do consulting work, but as part of the sales process, we do sort of like to say, are you aware of these things? Do you know that this is happening? Have you considered? And that kind of may change the stance of the hospital on the different solutions that they're going to look at or consider.
So it sounds like you're doing consultative selling, solution selling. What is your diagnosis of the patient, in this case, the hospital administration? Why are they still not using these tools that have been around for a long time?
I think that it's adoption of a new technology is very complex, and getting people to the drive by a hospital to adopt a new technology can come from any number of places. It can come from perhaps the CIO. It can come from perhaps the CFO. It can come from the director of clinical engineering. It can come from the director of nursing, biomedical engineering. So that is a little bit of a messy process to kind of understand. And once you have that project champion, they may be kind of the spiritual champion of the project, but they may need to spend somebody else's money to achieve that. So the level of internal coordination that's required to really launch this campaign to adopt a new technology is just, the sales cycles are very, very long. And I think that is why there's a lot of companies that are kind of raising their hand and saying, hey, we're in this business. We got this. We can manage your assets. And they may not realize that it could take 5 years for them to make a sale. That's a little bit of an exaggeration, but a very, very long time. And so given that cycle, I think that also leads to hospitals making decisions that are inherently a little bit more conservative about companies that have seen this, been there, done that, that are going to be around in 5-10 years, as opposed to kind of like, hey, we got your engineering solution, we got it, let's deploy it. So I don't think it's. And I can keep adding layers to this cake, but you've got the layer of positions are always turning over, at every level.
That is the challenge, isn't it? If the time to implement is 36 months and the average tenure of a CIO is 24 months, then you've got an inherent problem there. And you've got to just hope that you've got someone who's beating the averages, or maybe their successor will see an opportunity to take credit for something that's teed up and ready to go. But that is actually one of the issues, is the massive churn of staff. And I see that in retail. You forge relationships, well, throughout business. You forge relationships, and you're taking a gamble. You're betting on the person as well as the institution that you're selling to, just in the same way as they're betting on you. So I guess, does that actually factor in your qualification? Do you think this person's got a problem I can solve, they've got budget, the project's big enough, but this guy or gal is just not going to be around long enough to see this through? Is that?
I mean, it's impossible to use that as, we can't benchmark that. We can't plan for that unless they tell us, which would be unusual. But so we try and diversify the interest in the solution and try and bring in as many stakeholders as possible throughout the process, so that if somebody does depart, they are not the only kind of champion of the project. Somebody else can kind of pick it up. But, we've had things stall out for a long time because somebody left and they kind of got put by the wayside, and it was of interest to somebody else, but it wasn't their it wasn't their priority. So it, kind of got iced for a while. And then somebody else comes in or something happens, and lo and behold, let's go. We're ready to do this thing.
I do want to get into the technology, which was sort of the hook that got me interested in this conversation. But this is just too good to give up, because I think, again, our audience, I like to think, are solution designers and entrepreneurs, be they technical or business. And so what we're talking about is very important for the longevity of anyone that is designing solutions. You can be the best architect in the world, but if your building never gets built, then what's the point? So where's the money in the organization? You did a really nice job of enumerating who the stakeholders were, but presumably all stakeholders are not equal. And you pointed out that one stakeholder may have to dip their hand in another stakeholder's pocket. Who tends to have the deepest pockets?
To be honest, that would probably be a little bit more of a sales question than I am intimately knowledgeable about. But between those three roles, typically money can be found, or sometimes it's not even an issue of finding money. It's just an issue of proving that the solution will actually generate money and save money. And that's kind of the mental hurdle. Like, yes, this is going to cost us, but not doing it is going to cost us more. And sharing that message, and not just us. Here's the important thing: it's not just us sharing that message. It could be us saying, "Why don't you go talk to our other customer who is in your analogous role at a different hospital? Because we drink our own Kool-Aid, but you should drink, whatever Kool-Aid you want, and go talk to somebody out there who's benefited from some of these solutions." And that really, hands down, is, just extraordinarily powerful when we're in the situation where we are referring to other successful projects and allowing people to speak to their counterparts who really understand like the specific challenges that they are in, the specific questions that they're trying to answer, and have lived for years with, kind of the fruit of a solution that's been implemented.
Very good. Well, let's get back to the technology then. We talked a little bit about light-based systems and kind of eased our way towards radio frequency-based systems. But what are the what would you say are the prime tools in your kit bag that you find you're using now, and how has that changed?
It's changed quite a bit and I'll kind of go back deep here in company history. But when the company was founded, this was all RFID technology using handheld scanners and people going around constantly circulating in a hospital to scan a room, typically a room where inventory is expected to be, like a clean room or a soiled room, and scanning the barcode on the door jamb, and and then uploading asset locations as frequently as the rounds were completed to kind of simulate a real-time visibility. And that was very, that was much more effective than not having any solution. And efficacy of that actually led Vizzia to be selected by a hospital to run their equipment distribution center. And so that's kind of a tangent and another kind of real world environment where we have learned a lot of lessons about equipment distribution and the specific challenges in it. And we still do that in Southern California. But to get back to your question, there are so many technologies out there that are really kind of trying to crack the nut of relative low expense, longevity, wide coverage of use cases, easy to deploy, easy to maintain. I could keep going, but those are some of the big ones. And so, I think that different OEMs are going about that in their different ways according to sort of the heritage and expertise in that organization. And I think it can be achieved. I have seen just a lot of progress. There's ultra wideband is very impressive in some regards. But I think the discussion that we see when we're looking at the different dimensions to evaluate an RTLS, it reminds me a little bit of like Pokemon cards or something like that, where you have I never played Pokemon, so I hope this holds. But you have a character on a card, and they have different attributes of like strength, or maybe Dungeons and Dragons. I can relate to that. And so there is no solution out there that is just across the board like the obvious winner. We are in a period of immense competition right now with companies like duking it out. And they're, to some extent, they're kind of duking it out in the dark, because if you are trying to develop an RTLS, it's not like you have access. It's not like you can order a demo kit from every other OEM out there and kind of bring it in and deploy it and figure out how to do better than it. So part of what we do in the lab is we provide feedback to the OEMs in an anonymized fashion about our understanding of the capabilities of that system and how they stack up against kind of other offerings. We look at cost models, we look at ease of deployment, ease of ownership, accuracy, like all those kind of different dimensions that are, a long list. But I suppose that, the highest concentration of OEMs right now appear to be working in Bluetooth, and to kind of leverage the standards that exist and the ubiquity and availability of hardware to try and best crack that nut as best as possible. And even, organizations that may not have a heritage of Bluetooth, like they've been created based on a different locating technology, they are also looking at, are there ways that I can integrate Bluetooth, and what does that mean if we were to do that? Like, what use cases does it support? What does it unlock? What value does it create? So that's, that's like at a very high level. Obviously, I'm not getting too granular on it, but that's a lot of what I see, and kind of where the hot spot of interest is when you are considering RTLS that are maybe standalone solutions. And by standalone, I mean, that are not necessarily leveraging like access points that have Bluetooth. The other interesting area where I think there's a lot of movement, and I can certainly see a lot of potential, is riding on the back of infrastructure that already exists and is ubiquitous in a building, like lighting. So it could be using, attempting to use visual light communication to establish location. It could be embedding Bluetooth sensors in light trays, which are, obviously like in every room, and are already wired, are going to be installed by a different, a non-special, or an electrician, so it doesn't require retaining a specialized trade to do that. So those are kind of some of the areas that I see a lot of movement, and I think that there's a lot of smart consumers out there who are kind of waiting for something to break in a significant way that really does result in a system where, your Dungeons and Dragons card of that system like has really high marks across all of the different dimensions, except for cost, low mark.
Yeah. Maybe it's a matter of having a few of the right cards that complement each other. So you have, you have a team that where there's people that are good at defense and attack and all that sort of stuff. I've actually never played Dungeons and Dragons, but I've played a lot of computer games that I think have been derived from it. So what about angle of arrival for Bluetooth? Are you seeing uptake on that? Because that seems to, but you can imagine a system that of Bluetooth readers that do angle of arrival, but also can, just listen as well. And I always felt like, well, this is basically an ecosystem that Cooper just owns, but now there are other vendors, Chinese vendors, and the Bluetooth 5.1 standard has been out long enough that there's more than one source for angle of arrival. Is that becoming established, would you say?
I would say that there's a lot of interest in it. When I think of a solution like that, which, angle of arrival, typically the devices are fairly expensive due to the complexity of the antennas inside. And, typically they're going to require PoE. So
power over Ethernet.
Right, power over Ethernet. And when you look at those two requirements and you kind of compare it to the real close-knit scale of hospital rooms, that's a heavy lift to bring PoE into every room. It's a very disruptive process in a hospital. Like, you're moving ceiling tiles, you're doing dust isolation, negative pressure areas. So, although it can result in a very durable, very accurate system, there are just some kind of architectural and realistic constraints in it. So, for example, the hockey puck tracking that I think Koopa did a movie of. Like, that is a brilliant use of that. You've got a wide open area, you have really clear sight lines, you have that, very high level of accuracy, extremely low latency. But I suppose I question how well a system with those requirements kind of maps onto an extremely different architecture and environment.
Yeah, good observation. Interesting. You mentioned negative pressure, and I think I understand that, but can you unpack it a bit? And
yeah, it's simply that if you are in a patient room, if you're moving around architectural acoustic ceiling tiles, you're going to generate dust, and you need a way to contain the dust. And so you have to set up some kind of let's call it a tent around the workspace so that that dust does not bleed out into the rest of the patient room. So, the requirements, if you're trying to install something where you need to move around acoustical ceiling tiles in a live hospital environment, well, first of all, you can imagine that it's not possible if the room is being used. So then you get into a deploy scenario where we're trying to kind of play whack-a-mole, where, like, is that room empty? Like, can we get in there? Who's coming? Like, are we getting a bed come in? Like, do we have the time that we need? It's very messy, essentially, to do that. And not to mention the cost. Anytime you're adding PoE, you're adding switches, you're potentially paying for union labor. You're creating a lot of disruption. Less in a kind of a greenfield or a new project, but to kind of retrofit an existing hospital to the point where you need PoE in every room or even every other room. Like, it's very demanding. Somebody needs to feel very committed to that particular approach.
And which is difficult when you're pioneering. If everyone was doing it, then it would just be the cost of doing business. But before you get kind of mass adoption, then it's a little trickier. You mentioned VLC, visual light communication, and it occurs to me last time we covered this was years ago. So can you just explain briefly what that is?
Sure. Visual light communication rides on kind of the similar idea of, let's leverage a ubiquitous element that is required to be present in a building or, in our case, in a hospital. So we're leveraging these lighting trays, and we are controlling the flashing, essentially, of the light in a way that we can communicate information about the specific location of that light fixture or a group of light fixtures. And it's super interesting. I think it's, just the idea that it could potentially use or leverage, or with a small modification, you could achieve ubiquity across a hospital is very appealing. The challenge is that, it is visual light communication. So if you don't have a visual of it, you are not going to know where you are. And, in order to get a visual of it, you need a camera. You need some kind of, lens on the tag, on the asset tag. And you're going to need a chip that's going to add more expense than kind of a Bluetooth chip. And so I think that there are circumstances where it can make a lot of sense and can be very powerful, but there are also some, constraints in that. Using an iPhone, for example, with a front-forward camera and walking around is a perfect match for visual light communication. Like someone is trying to navigate, they have their phone out, it's seeing the sequence of flashes, it's communicating with the cloud to understand where it is, great use case. But, something like where you have a tag, the tag could potentially be under a patient gown or on the bottom side of a bed or, in some location that is required due to the clinical needs of that equipment. It may not see some of that.
Yeah, it's phenomenal technology. When I was at Qualcomm, we got to tap into this treasure trove of IP and technologies that have been developed by Qualcomm Labs, which is like basically Qualcomm at the time was spending, I think, about $5 billion a year on R&D. So they had just so much. And VLC, visual light communication, was one of the technologies they worked on because you could use a phone and it had the camera. And so in many ways, that was free, and everyone's getting LED lighting that has this ability to essentially transmit Morse code only so fast you can't see it. You don't detect the flicker. And then they were showing centimeter level accuracy in X, Y, and Z dimensions, which is just phenomenal. Very, very impressive if you've got the camera out. And so I think our answer then was, well, we'll use BLE in combination with VLC. So you'll know that you're in the zone because of BLE. BLE could push out a message that triggers an app. You open the app and then the app starts using the camera and you're off to the races. But a lot of fun. I feel like we've been going for a while here. I feel I'd love to go longer, but we should probably wrap it up. Any other key technology trends that you think we should cover before we move on to the fun part of the show where we get to talk about your background and music choices?
Well, I am excited about the work that you are doing and kind of how we are going to move into a level of just extreme ubiquitousness of tags that provide a wide range of price points and capabilities that allow us to, I'm keeping an eye on kind of the progress and movement in that space, and I'm quite excited about it. I'm quite interested in how it develops.
Yeah, so I mean, my day job is at Wiliot. So they're a sponsor of this podcast. So we'll take a minute just to talk about that. I absolutely hadn't been planning to do this, but we've been flirting in this area of healthcare for some time, for all the obvious reasons. It's kind of a well-established market, and the tracking of infusion pumps and other high-cost capital assets. That's a well-trod lane. It has all the issues that you've described, but I think the opportunity to, when you're using we call them pixels, but postage stamp sized stickers that can broadcast Bluetooth. The way I see that working is, I'm using my battery powered tags and maybe even doing angle of arrival for certain use cases, but I can use that infrastructure to also listen to the broadcasts from these things. And then I have the option to start tagging consumable assets, not just fixed assets. So I can start tagging the face masks back in the day when those were in desperately short supply, and I can see where those are being hoarded. And one of the use cases I really love is the consignment use case, where you have increasingly, hospitals are a business, capital's in short supply. We're seeing providers of products that are saying to hospitals, you don't even need to buy this product. So I'm going to supply you with whatever it is, arm braces or knee braces, and I'm going to put a supply on your in your hospital, in your clinic. You don't need to buy it. When it gets dispensed and given to a patient, I'm just going to bill the insurance company directly. And that works great as long as you don't lose track of the arm braces and the knee braces. So if you have the ability to tag them with a Bluetooth sticker, then you can start to perform this financial engineering, which has really got nothing to do with radio waves and angle of arrival. It's just like making sure that you solve the problem of a busy nurse not signing out and doing the paperwork. You can see where products have gone, and that allows you to suddenly take a whole bunch of cost and capital requirements away from the hospital and start some very innovative financial engineering as well as wireless engineering. But I think, and tracking instruments in operating theaters. There's so many interesting use cases. So
I will add a small comment that we do track rental consignment equipment, and we have a module. Again, we've been really dialing in software very, very specific to our users, and so we have a module that allows customers to track rental equipment. And for some of those customers, one of the reports that we create is their source of truth for billing. We're not down to the mask level, but that is true for rental consignment equipment in some cases.
Very interesting. Well, actually, one thing I did want to ask you about was the Wi-Fi access point providers, the Arubas, the Cisco Meraki's. They all have a play in RTLS. Are you seeing them getting any traction? There's certainly for companies like ours, they're a gateway from Bluetooth to the wide area network. So they have a role to play there, but they can also do coarse grain location tracking, zonal location tracking. Is that getting any uptake?
Yeah, it's getting a lot of uptake of conversation for sure, because the idea that, we've already got all the hardware that we need, very appealing. Who doesn't want to believe that they, the new APs that they just, installed, who doesn't want to believe that those are capable of additional use cases? So it's a very compelling idea that you can leverage existing technology. It's been around for a while, but it is really gaining traction right now. I think that the question that it's all about just understanding what are you trying to accomplish? Because yes, you can get, moderate level of location accuracy leveraging that existing technology. And of course, it has to be installed at the right density. You have to have good coverage. It's not just like, we selected this model, so, we're good to go. There are plenty of other conditions that need to be met. And I believe that you also need to enable those services and pay a fee to use them. So if you are combining kind of all those things where you're looking at, cost to enable the service, you've got the service enabled, but do you have a great piece of software that does what you need to do with that information? If not, who's providing it? Where is it coming from? How are you creating value from that information? And even if you do have a great piece of software, let's just be really clear about what that type of accuracy, which would not fall under the level of like room level certainty. It's like you said, it's kind of much more zonal. We're drawing a bigger circle around our blue dot is bigger. What are we trying to solve for? What can we solve for with that information? And if you're talking about some of the entry level, I'll call them entry level, but they're the entry level on more familiar use cases like asset tracking, that might be fine. That might be all that you need. You send an equipment technician out and you say, it's in one of those 4 rooms. I don't know which one, but go check. You'll find. But, again, like when you move up the spectrum of use cases, the question to the customer is then, sure, that this is a solution. Are you okay knowing that this infrastructure will not be able to provide you at any point? No, I won't say at any point, but for the foreseeable future, it will not be able to support these use cases. And when you bring in, a use case like hand hygiene, for example, which has real numbers associated with it and real, it's tied to reimbursable rates. It's, the financial argument to invest in a system that can support that changes with those use cases.
What about the electromagnetic field sensing? Are you seeing anything from that? We've had one of the leading vendors of that on the podcast a few months ago, and there's another one which I came across recently called Orient, spelt with 2 I's. They're an Israeli company. And it seems pretty amazing. They're basically looking at the Earth's and the building's magnetic fluctuations, which are like a signature. And, rather like when you run a mag stripe through an old-fashioned credit card reader, you get data. That data comes from the compass in your phone, and you can work out pretty accurately, as long as the person's moving, where they are. Is that anything that's hit your radar yet, or not?
No, but I am going to check out that podcast.
Yeah. So have a look. I'm having a senior moment in terms of who the previous vendor was, but it was definitely earlier this year. And as I say, Orient are a competitor, and we're finding that very interesting because we see the value of mobile readers. The phone is a great reader of Bluetooth tag technology, especially low-cost tags. And in the future, it'll be an energy source, either because the firmware will be activated on the phones to use the radios that are kind of sitting latent, or when we have our next generation of tags, they'll be able to sip away at even weaker sources of energy. But that's going to allow us to use the phone more and more as opposed to fixed infrastructure. And, whether it's a phone or some kind of Zebra Android device, then there's, more and more staff are being given tablets, are being given phones, it seems to me at least. And then you can use that to essentially survey and crowdsource the location of tags. And we've seen, certainly in the retail context, you can cover pretty much the 100% of the footprint of the store over a given period of time of somebody walking around with their phone. With that, so that means you combine that with something like Orient, where you can tell where the phone is. So I know where the phone is. I know what the phone can see. And then I don't need to start punching holes in walls or worrying about power over Ethernet.
I will definitely learn more about that. I had some experience with the like RF fingerprinting and kind of the capabilities of that. And I'm reminded a little bit of, do you remember that Matthew McConaughey movie where he communicates across time using gravity with his daughter? Does that ring any bells?
Yeah.
Since I rewatched that movie, I think I watched it, when it first came out, and then I rewatched it, and I made a mental bookmark to myself. thinking, I need to learn more about gravity. This is really, really cool.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So the magnetic field reading, it's a cool area. It's been around for a while, and it seems to be getting traction. And no infrastructure is the promise. But like all these things, it has limitations. Well, very good, Andreas. Thanks so much. We've got another part of our conversation to do, but thanks for the business side of it. And I urge people to stay on and hear what your three songs are and how landscape architecture meets RTLS in a very interesting manner.
Thank you so much. It was an absolute pleasure.
So I was really struck when I was looking at your LinkedIn profile that seems like you started off as a landscape architect. Is that right?
I did. I went to UC Berkeley and earned a master's degree in landscape architecture, and worked for a brief stint into kind of the economic collapse of 2008, 2009. And then started a firm, mostly because that was the option that was available at the time. There were not a lot of places hiring. And I had a couple of good relationships, and one thing led to another. And I started and ran a design firm in the Bay Area for about 10 years. We had a small crew there, and then we moved to Portland. And so we had a
Oregon.
Portland, Oregon, correct.
Yeah.
We opened up another small office there, and we were kind of in the backdrop. It was we were starting a family at the time, and we kind of had this realization, and my wife and I, we had this realization that, oh my gosh, we're really far from all of our family, and so long as we have the option or can create the option to have our family kind of in the context of more family, and that geography and people were welcoming towards that, we decided to make a big move. And with that came a significant career change as well.
So it was when you moved to Albuquerque that you gave up the landscape architecture practice?
They were almost synchronous. They weren't 100% synchronous, but yeah. It's been a transition that I've reflected on quite a bit, and I've done a lot of reading and actually some writing about it too. If anybody's interested, I can.
Yeah. Well, I'm interested. Well, because my father was a landscape architect at one point, and so we're all obsessed with our fathers, or at least I am, and so any profession that he had is immediately about 4 times more interesting to me. He was also a philosopher, and I am always struck when I talk to people who are in technology who come from an area that seems completely unrelated, and both of those and I've met some brilliant computer scientists and technologists who just have developed great mental faculties, and somehow they've pivoted. How did you get from landscape architecture to real-time location systems, which is like computing and radio frequency technology? And it's like, I can't think of anything further away.
Well, okay. This is a great opportunity to make an argument then.
Okay.
So first I should say that the space that Vizzia inhabits is not the hardware layer. We work with a lot of OEMs and leverage their technology and create a software product using it. We are a hardware agnostic company, so we, and I can talk about that a little bit later, but essentially, what I'm creating is a product of value, and the process of creating that software product, especially because it is there's a lot of stakeholders, it's complex, there is bureaucracy, it has geospatial components to it. a large part of the success of it is communication and adoption. And if you look at all of those skills, like what else is an architect but a product manager of a building? So
I got to hand it to you. It's a compelling argument.
And yeah, I could really keep going, but I'll keep it kind of succinct at that level. But I was, it was a little bit, it was a little bit of an abrupt transition, and it took me a little bit of time to put all the pieces together and realize that a lot of the value that I was carrying forward, and had to retrain for a different subject matter. But, as a landscape architect, and for folks who may not know, that's simply an architect of outdoor spaces, plazas, schools, playgrounds, etc. It's all the same process of understanding your stakeholders, understanding what they need, putting together a concept design, understanding the technical constraints, working with kind of individuals who are excellent at their individual craft, but also often need some kind of cross-functional communication, let's call it. So I've been very pleased, and I'm very grateful towards my design background and the professional work that I did to learn a rigorous design process and what that looks like. And I think that, especially in the context of, we make software for hospitals essentially. And a hospital is a complex social, physical environment. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that I believe I can add in value is the knowledge that the success of a solution is so much, it is an engineering solution. All of real-time location systems are a marvel of engineering, but in order to provide value, it's less of an engineering problem and more of a communication challenge, a support, sort of it's relying on a lot of skills that folks with engineering backgrounds, sort of pure engineering backgrounds, like to call soft skills. Mm-hmm. But they're not really soft, they're just skills. And they often kind of make the difference between two excellent and well-engineered products, one of them being widely adopted in use and thriving, and the other kind of withering on the vine.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I feel like you just rewired my brain, and that's partially what you have to do when you're selling a product and when you are getting people to use it. You have to persuade them to change, to see things in a different way. And there are so many of those non-technical aspects to success of any enterprise. And in doing this, you've made me even more interested in what your music choices are. So give us your 3 songs that
all right. Well, I picked 3. The first is an album, actually, and it's an album that was left by the previous owner in a used car that I bought when I first kind of made my big I'm going west to explore the world and find myself.
Are we talking CD, cassette, 8-track, or a big vinyl record that was left on the back seat?
No, it was a CD. It was also the first car that I owned that had a CD player, so it was very exciting. And it was a Dixie Chicks album called Wide Open Spaces, and it kind of corresponded to that phase of life, kind of driving west into the unknown to kind of go on a journey of self-discovery. So that was one, and I like the songs, but more I like, what it represents and kind of how it reminds me of that specific journey.
Outstanding. What's number 2?
The number two is something I had listened to the other day. So we live close to the Rio Grande River, which is home to the largest contiguous cottonwood forest I believe, in the world. And this time of year, it's stunningly beautiful outside. And so I went for a bike ride the other day, and I listened to Into the Great Wide Open. And it kind of has this ascendant, soaring quality to it with, the strong southwestern light coming in through the cottonwoods and the yellow trees. And so it was a very kind of beautiful moment.
I'm not familiar. Is this an orchestral piece, or who's
no,
it from?
It's Tom Petty.
Okay.
Yeah, it's kind of
Yeah.
It's actually out of the realm of what I typically listen to, but it just kind of surfaced at that moment, and I went with it. And then the last one was a song that some friends of ours performed when we got married, and it's the song Emmylou by First Aid Kit. And they performed it without lyrics. And so it just has a very special place in my heart because it reminds me of my wedding, and also, some friends who are lovely enough to lug some instruments out to kind of
and where did you get married? Man, that is small. And whereabouts in California is Volcano?
Volcano's in the foothills. It's been a while. So it's east of Sacramento.
Okay.
Kind of in the foothills. I'm struggling a little bit to tell you what it's.
Yeah.
It wasn't near that much, which was part of the draw.
Okay, so you just tried to find a place where no one would bother you, and to cut down on the expense because you knew that there wouldn't be people there, or is there another connection?
No, well, okay, so you're really pulling at the ball of twine now. So I was actually working on a project out there, a residential project, and we went out there to do a site visit. This is my landscape architecture days. Yeah. And really just loved the place and realized that it had one park, it had 2 small hotels, it had one of everything. And so we decided that that was all we needed. We needed one of everything. We needed to double the population of the town, and we needed to have a great party, and we did.
Amazing. Well, this has been great. Andreas, it's been a delight, a real pleasure. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Likewise, and I'm so grateful for the amount of sharing that you do. I feel like you have generated and been extremely generous with all of your conversations in a very brave way. So I just wanted to say that I'm grateful for that as a person who has learned so much from your media and your sharing.
Wonderful. Well, I appreciate that. Thank you. Thanks for watching this episode of the Mr. Beacon Ambient IoT podcast here on YouTube. You can listen to this episode on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you enjoyed it, please like and share this video. And be sure to subscribe for more videos. For more information about Wiliot, Ambient IoT, and IoT Pixels, head over to wiliot.com.